Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time it's going to look a little bit different. I'm on the road, but I'm still bringing it to you. I got coffee, I got internet access, so here we go, we'll make it work. I've started looking at a couple of the midterms. Those look great so far. It seemed like there was a little confusion about the first question and filling that in, but that seems to have gotten worked out. We took care of it, so we're back on track there. I'll get those up and graded this week for sure. So don't worry too much about that. This week, we're going to start talking about 19th century encounters between civilizations. And what do I mean by that? Well, specifically, we're going to kind of pick up from that early modern period where we left off last time and think about how the world was just fundamentally changed, particularly after industrialization and more Europeans traveling outside of Europe, these sorts of things. And this so-called sort of rise of the West is going to hit particularly hard for China and Japan, in that their societies are going to have to completely readjust and react, and they realize very quickly that if they don't figure out some sort of alternative to whatever they were doing, Europeans are going to monopolize trade, are going to dictate foreign policy, are going to cause all kinds of problems for these sort of new or newly developing nations and political systems that are occurring in China and Japan. So first we'll look just briefly again, touch back on those early modern interactions. It's some slides that you've seen before, but I want to just kind of talk through them. Then we'll talk about China, the sort of internal and external threats they were facing during the sort of later Qing dynasty. Then we'll talk about the sort of ending of Tokugawa, really, and their first interactions with Westerners on a large scale and what that meant for Japanese society. So early modern interactions, as I said before, we talked about this kind of at length last time, had the discussion about it. I just want to kind of touch base on these again because they lead sort of right directly into what we're talking about. So you'll have seen a lot of this material before, but it's good just to get a quick overview. I'll go a little bit faster maybe than I did last time, just because it's already kind of assumed that you guys are right there with me. If not, it'll be a good review for some of that material. So remember, we looked at Europeans in China. So put aside the fact that China has always had contact with Afro-Eurasia, right? The Silk Roads are 2,000 years old by this point. There were water routeways to Southeast Asia, to India, to East Africa. Europe was kind of the backwater of the system. As we talked about before, that changes during the 1400s and 1500s. And the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty are going to come into much more prolonged contact with Europeans. So we looked at during the Ming Dynasty, there was a lot of ambivalence towards Jesuits, towards Christian missionaries, towards foreign influence, these people coming from the south. But they did like some stuff. Christianity, not so much, but they really liked clocks, astronomical data, this idea about new European learnings. Of course, the Chinese liked this. New technology that makes life easier or more efficient or makes your military stronger is always appreciated. But the sort of cultural supremacy that Europeans were starting to feel about themselves was not appreciated. So the Ming don't really look too favorably on these sort of new, what comes to be called Southern barbarians, right? We also saw the Dutch coming into the region. So they're going to have a sort of big influence in Japan, but they're in Southeast Asia. They have a huge complex at Batavia and Java, which is the sort of Indonesian stronghold of Dutch power in Southeast Asia. And they were trying to get in on the China trade between China and Southeast Asia, also between Japan and China and Japan and Southeast Asia. So we saw that they built a sort of trading posts in Taiwan, but that doesn't really last too long. There's sort of too much vigorous trade between China and Southeast Asia for them to monopolize it. It doesn't really quite work. They're overextended. so that colony is not gonna pan out for them that much. Also, the Dutch find a better home at Nagasaki in Japan anyway, which we'll get to today much more. The Qing dynasty, even less friendly than the Ming. In part, this has to do with the so-called rights controversy. Basically, in 1704, there had already been an ongoing long discussion amongst Catholics about the Chinese practice of ancestor worship and whether it constituted a religion or not. And the Pope basically ruled that venerating the ancestors, practicing the Confucian rites, was a form of religion. Thus, if you wanted to be a good Catholic convert, you would have to eschew those rites and no longer venerate your ancestors or pray to them or talk to them or these sorts of things. Most Chinese found this incredibly repugnant. Remember, Confucianism has just been baked into the culture. It's not seen as a separate religion. The idea of separate religion that you choose between and stuff is a very Western concept. For most Chinese, these rites were just part of being alive, part of being Chinese, part of being a good community member, a good family member. So it really didn't fly. And that Emperor Kangxi, who we talked about a little bit last time, passed an edict that basically forbid all missionary activity in China, which was a problem because this was also the time when Europeans were wanting more and more stuff from China, like these wonderful vases and porcelain works. And so more and more European ships are coming, which includes more missionaries. Also, there was this idea that all the Europeans were Christian and hence pushing Christianity. So it sort of gets tied together. And basically, the Chinese government stance is that Europeans shouldn't be allowed into China and they shouldn't be allowed to actively go around on their own. This might lead to more missionary activity that they didn't want, or sort of subversion of Chinese culture. Here's a good depiction of some of that that learning. Kangxi, right, was an intellectual. He wasn't just a gut check reaction trying to get rid of Christianity. He was actually pretty wise and had studied what sort of happens in these situations. So he was making a pretty strategic choice rather than sort of a xenophobic choice. Then we looked a little bit last time too at Ming and Qing trade, because there's often this sort of myth that, oh, you know, these were like inscrutable Asian lands that had no contact with the West, and then, you know, Westernism falls on them or something. That's not really true, but the Ming and Qing both controlled a lot of the state's economy. And as there were issues with missionaries, as there were problems with these new southern barbarians, that conservative ideology that was there in the late Ming and in the Qing really kicks in more. And remember, there had been that traditional narrative that the danger always comes from the north. This is where the Mongols came from. This is where the Hu, all those Turkish tribes, this is where the Qing themselves came from. But now you had this new thing, these southern barbarians that were showing up in ships in the south, and it just kind of threw off the elite sort of Chinese thinking about where the danger to China is. They weren't prepared to deal with it. It didn't make sense. And these southern barbarians, remember, barbarians here just means like non-Chinese people, right? It's just the sort of phrasing they use and how it was translated into English. These like southern non-Chinese people that are showing up were kind of confusing. They didn't have horses, they weren't riding, trying to destroy. They were very, very interested in trade, but remember, in the Confucian model, merchants are not high-class people or high socially. They're seen as a less desirable element of society. So the fact that they wanted to trade a lot and stuff also didn't really necessarily impress the Chinese. So there's a lot of issues. Then the Chinese government is going to regulate trade and delegate certain areas on the coast where they do allow it. Because remember, China's producing tons and tons of tea, tons and tons of porcelain. They want that silver from the Americas and from European transportation. So they do want that. But they don't really care for British goods or Dutch goods or anything too much. So what's really happening is in these southern ports, Europeans are seeking to buy Chinese products with silver and then, engage in some other sorts of trade. And this leads to what's called the factory system. And we talked about this just a little bit. Here's an image of Guangzhou, right, which is just north of Hong Kong, where foreigners were allowed to go and deposit some products they hope to trade, bring in their silver, and then on the flip side, the Chinese would bring their commercial products down to Guangzhou to these factories, which just meant a big storehouse. There didn't mean industrialized factories or something like that. And then they could negotiate through. But the negotiation was always done through the Hongs, which were these sort of intermediaries that were on the Chinese side that controlled trade. Theoretically, all the trade was controlled by Chinese. This leads to a huge trade imbalance, though. If the Europeans don't particularly have anything the Chinese want, Europeans just want a bunch of Chinese products. The only thing they have to give them is cash, right, in the form of silver. Ideally, this is not how trade works. If you've taken your good economics class, ideally the Europeans would be making some sort of product that they would be selling to the Chinese would be making some sort of product they would be selling to the Europeans. That way you get more movement of product and cash, more liquidity in the market, and all that sort of stuff. More sort of movement and sort of balance in trade. But that's not what's happening. We're going to see that's going to come back. Europeans are desperate to find something they can do. At the same time, here's that tea that Europeans wanted. At the same time, tons of Chinese, right, are heading to Southeast Asia. We looked at this a little bit, to the Philippines, to Thailand, Cambodia, right, what today is Vietnam and Indonesia, and creating rather large populations. So it's not like they were totally closed off or something. That's a myth. So what about in Japan? We looked at this a little bit too last time. Remember, the Tokugawa were motivated by similar sort of conservative policies as the Chinese. Some of this is arising from Confucianism. Some of this is arising from the end of the civil wars and the foundation of Tokugawa itself. Some of this is arising from Europeans just showing up, bringing Christianity, bringing missionaries, demanding trade that the Japanese didn't particularly want or felt was a burden to them or didn't like the terms of it. So after a particular flare-up where the Tokugawa Shogunate outlawed Christianity and sort of expelled a lot of Europeans, the Dutch were allowed to remain. There they are on the left, chatting up some ladies on this island off Nagasaki, right? And basically in the harbor off Nagasaki, about a mile offshore, or about a mile offshore, there was a trading island where the Dutch could pull in. They could unload their money and any kind of trade that they had. They were bringing some things from Southeast Asia, some things from Europe, to trade with the Japanese. But it wasn't a very big or lucrative trade. At the same time, Japan continues to have outreach. They're in diplomatic and economic and migratory exchanges with China, Korea, the Ryukyu Kingdom, right, which is going to become Okinawa, Southeast Asia. So the idea that China was completely shut, or Japan was completely shut, which you'll frequently see in textbooks, that's sort of a dumbed down version. It's kind of true from the European perspective. From every other perspective, though, it's not real. Lots of Japanese traveled to Southeast Asia. Oh yeah, here's that picture for you of Nagasaki, one of the sort of delegation quarters where the Dutch could bring their things. So you see like the Dutch flag there, right, on the island. So this really interesting early period where the Japanese are starting to experience Dutch culture and vice versa. You get some interesting artwork during this period, stuff like that. Here's another depiction of the island, this one from a more Dutch perspective, right? More Dutch-centric. And there's weird, interesting stories that arise during this time. So, for example, very famously during this time, a few samurai left Japan and were employed by the Thai state as sort of bodyguards and military personnel that worked with the Thai Sukhothai government for military and political purposes. So there are a number of exchanges. Actually, this is from a Sweet movie. They make a great movie about this that's in Thai that you can Google. Just Google like Thai samurai, pop up if you're interested in that. But the majority of Japanese going to Southeast Asia were women who would serve as prostitutes. It wasn't a denigrated profession in the same way that I think a lot of people think of it now in the US, and money was basically collected and sent home. There were also pirates, but as you may have read last time, the sort of idea of Japanese pirates is really complex. A lot of Japanese pirates were Chinese, Korean, Filipino, right? So it's all mixed up. But there was a sort of social presence of Japan outside of the archipelago. It wasn't just totally closed off, as is frequently imagined. Okay, so let's get into it in terms of these 19th century interactions between Europe and China. You've probably heard of many of these before, as this is often a really big part of a world history class or any kind of class that's going to think about British Empire or talk about colonialism, often sort of touches on these sorts of things. China, remember, up until the 18th or 19th century even, can be thought of as the biggest empire, the biggest state, the biggest economy in the world. In the 20th century, something really weird happens where China was not the center of the world. And that starts in the 19th century. And that's the unusual thing. Now there's people are talking about, oh, the rise of China and stuff like this. But really, for most of human history, China has been the biggest political entity. So in the 19th and 20th century, there's sort of this dip where China's not anymore, but that's the unusual situation, not the norm. So if China did go back to being number one in the world, that would be more in line with all of our previous history. Anywho, during the 19th century, this sort of Western contact is going to lead to big trouble for China. It turns out they're not quite prepared for what they're going to get. So the big problems for China are really going to start when Britain's run into problems of its own. You guys are probably familiar, you all are probably familiar with the American Revolution and breaking away from Britain to some extent, just from all of your previous history classes and such. That is often depicted as an American event that doesn't really relate to the British Empire for some strange reason. But from the perspective of the British Empire, the United States breaking away was a huge deal and caused a bunch of problems and ripple effects. When the United States broke away, it fundamentally changed how the British Empire worked. So we've seen that foreign traders were in southern China. There were, the Dutch, the French, the Americans, the British, but the main traders up until this period were the British in southern China. And they were trading more and more silver. By this point, by 1750 or so, the Spanish and the Portuguese are kind of fading out. That's another world history story for you. But the British didn't particularly have anything to give the Chinese, right, other than money. And that's a problem, that massive trade deficit. So the British were really looking for something new that they could trade into China to switch that trade deficit so that instead of just bleeding money for the products they wanted, they could, balance it out. So remember, they had to deal through these hongs. They had to bring something to them that they wanted to trade. And so you have to find something that people are interested that they think they can sell in China. And they just really couldn't do it. But the British had colonized India, in particular the East Indian Company. And if you know the story of sort of British colonization in India, it's really strange. Britain didn't colonize India at first, right? At first, it's a company, the East India Company. The East India Company essentially manages to monopolize India. And at this time, companies were allowed to have militaries. They had a royal sanction from the crown. They could interfere with local governments. They could pass laws, all kinds of stuff like this. So they were effectively their own government in India. And then later, the British government is going to bail them out and just basically take over all the holdings of the East India Company and become the direct colonizers of India. It's kind of a strange story. Anywho, in India, the East India Company found a new product that maybe had some potential. This guy here, these poppies can help you make opium. So what happens is the poppies form these little flowers, but before they flower, they have that little ball, right? That's where the sort of, well, or let me go back. It flowers, after it flowers, if the flower's been fertilized, it forms this little ball. The ball is where all the seeds are going to be. But in there with the seeds is some juice. If you score the poppy pod in the right way, it basically leaks a little bit of that juice to seal off the seed pod, right? So there's a picture of some opium poppies. The seed pod's formed. You put a little slice in the side. That liquid comes out to seal up the slice. It's kind of like almost like a naturally occurring rubber or something like this. You've definitely seen this with plants. If you just go break a dandelion stem, you'll see like a little weird white liquid come to the end of it, right? That's attempting to like heal itself. So this is the same thing. You let that dry, and then later you come with a specially made knife and you scrape that stuff off of these pods, and that stuff is opium. You still have to process a little bit, but that's basically it. It's a pretty natural thing in comparison to many of the drugs that will be used to make in the future, like heroin. Anywho, these poppies are making opium. This was quite an old drug in India and China and Southeast Asia. People knew about it. Like most old drugs, it didn't get you like crazy high or something like that. It was pretty mild. People used it for toothaches, they used it for headaches, stuff like this, and basically you would eat it. You could also make it into a tea. Opium is it's not an upper, right? It makes you relaxed, it makes you see all kinds of different sort of visions when you have big doses of it. But basically, it's not a hallucinogen though, it's slightly different. Anyway, so the British had a new idea. So again, part of this global network, the British and Europeans in general had recently come into contact with tobacco a few hundred years earlier. So tobacco is a product that was grown by peoples in the Americas, kind of all over. In Central America and the Caribbean, the way you take tobacco is you grow the plant and you take the big green leaves and you squish it down and you ferment it and you get this juice and you drink it and then you like have like a trippy episode. But further away from where tobacco grew, the only way you could get it was dried. Those groups of indigenous Americans smoked it. That's what some of the British folks pick up on, some Europeans pick up on, because by the time they can get tobacco back to Europe, it's going to have to be dried anyway. So Europeans have started to smoke tobacco. So opium's an old drug, but the British introduced a new idea. What if in my cigarette here, like an opium spliff, what if I like put a little opium schmear inside of my cigarette here and smoke that, or I mix it with my tobacco and smoke it? All of a sudden, it's a new drug. It's an old product, but this new idea to smoke it really transformed its power. It makes it much more effective. It makes it go into you much quicker. It makes much more of the sort of chemical compounds responsible for your high. to actually hit your brain, right? You don't have to digest it or anything like that. So it's like if you've ever smoked marijuana or whatever, I don't know, whatever your stances are on that, doesn't particularly matter. You'll get high a lot more quickly than if you eat it, right? And it's very different. So anywho, this was a new idea, and the British sold it as a narcotic, essentially. And the Chinese have a large, long-running sort of pharmacopoeia and traditional medicine practices. Remember, traditional is always garbage, but what I mean by that is non-Western, right? By today's standards, I suppose, medical practices using herbs and animals and other products. So the British marketed this to an extent as another one of those sort of organic compounds for healthy living or medical use. After not very long, the Chinese know that it's not great for people, and they outlaw it. So it is a product that can sell in China. The British have it, but it's illegal. So some weird stuff starts happening. In 1770, there's a big famine in Bengal. This happens to be where a lot of this opium grows. So the British need to find a way to get more cash for this region, and they ask the British government for help. Remember, it's kind of confusing, right? Because it's the British people asking the British government, but basically the East India Company is going to ask the British government to help sort of bail them out. This is part of why the British government is going to start taxing the United States more, or not the United States yet, but the 13 colonies. So because they have a problem in one part of the empire, they try to squeeze another part of the empire. So the British government increases taxes on one of its productive colonies, or 13 of its productive colonies, in order to try and create more revenue for the empire itself. So this might be the Tea Act, right? Basically, where the British government imposed more taxes on tea going to the Americas. Also, the East India Company was allowed to create a monopoly on opium in Bengal, which meant they had a huge supply of access to it. As you might know, the tea tax in the United States was not beloved. Here are some white dudes dressing up as Native Americans to toss British tea into the harbor. So remember, this was all tea from China that would have been that green tea, not tea bags, not black tea. British didn't drink that yet. This was the American drink of choice, was green tea. This is what Washington grew up drinking and all that sort of stuff. However, after this, tea becomes less exciting in the US, right? And that's when you get the switch to coffee. Anyway, fun stuff for your US history class. So the British, this kind of backfires on them, right? Leading to the Revolutionary War and actually more loss of income. So now the British have lost those 13 colonies. The empire is kind of hurting. They still have this problem in India. So they really need to get new revenue streams from somewhere. And if you want to keep buying stuff from China just in cash, you don't have any revenue streams. You got to be able to sell the Chinese something. So this is when the British really start pushing opium into China, even though it's illegal. So here is a factory in Bengal. Basically all of that opium that I showed you, the stuff you scrape off the side of the plant, was formed into big sort of cannonball shaped things where you could just like break off a chunk, right, to smoke it. So you can see sort of some of the scale of the British production of opium, right? It's a really enormous amount. And they start shipping it to China into Guangzhou to sell. So here they are in Guangzhou selling opium, and the Hongs know they can sell this stuff in China. It's very clear early on that it's addictive. So finally the British have a product they can sell into China, even though it's illegal in China, right? But they're in the very far south, they're pretty far from the Chinese government. It's not like the Chinese government can directly intercede immediately. In the next 40 years, the British are pretty successful selling opium into China, but their monopoly is going to expire in Bengal over all of the opium. So other people start getting in on it. In particular, the United States becomes the #2 biggest opium pusher. That often gets left out of the story. But a lot of the wealthiest families in the United States got wealthy by selling opium to China, which you'll see in this video I'll show you in just a second. But anywho, so the Americans act mostly as runners between different places in India and Southeast Asia to bring opium into China as well. The amount of opium that goes into China during this period is absolutely incredible and skyrockets. As with any sort of addictive thing that you can sell, when there's no particular regulation of it, of course there's going to be a huge market. So if you look in the 1650s, very small amount. This is counting this chart, number of chests of opium. A chest, it says in this chart, is 140 pounds. So they were selling in 1650, 50 chests. So not a ton. But you can see this graph just goes nuts. By 1880, maybe 6,500 chests that are all 140 pounds of opium per year, right? Going in to China, that's an incredible amount, right? So the number of users is very high, the amount people are using is very high. This is going to cause all kinds of problems. For the Chinese government, though, one of the biggest problems is the trade imbalance is now switched. Now, the Chinese are buying so much opium that they're bleeding silver the wrong direction. So the Chinese had been sucking up all the silver and selling Europeans products, not really buying any European products. Now the Chinese can't keep up. They're selling all of their products and they still need more to buy more opium to bring in through these ports. So the Chinese economy is starting to undergo a really big sort of transformation. And the government decides to crack down on this because, of course, it's all illegal, right? So the person that the Chinese government is going to put in charge of this is Commissioner Lin Seshua. So Lin is a government official, right? In the Confucian tradition, the Chinese government has decided that opium is a moral and economic problem. It makes people into bad people. It's anti-Confucian. It's bad for the economy, all these sorts of things. Here's some people smoking opium in an opium den, right, is the place that you call these. It's like a bar, basically, but for opium. You go and you lay down and you smoke a pipe. You don't even have to light it. Someone just comes around and lights it for you, right? And you just kind of lay there and smoke opium all day. Bad for the economy. So the Qing government sends Lin down there to fix this problem by whatever means necessary. And he observes the situation and realizes it's much worse than anybody thought. He sees there are Chinese smugglers everywhere. Theoretically, right, opium's illegal, and the government has mandated several times that they stop importing it, but it keeps coming in. So thousands of smugglers are operating through those commercial channels, through those foreign delegation areas, through Guangzhou, basically. So when he does this, people start to get nervous. This is a huge economic racket, and all of a sudden you're arresting all the middlemen. Then Lin demands that all the British traders surrender any opium they have. Because if you're British and you're on Chinese soil and you have this opium, it's illegal. So the British soldiers don't particularly, or the British traders don't particularly know what to do. After some kerfuffling, they decide to give up their opium. Lin confiscates as much as 2.5 million pounds. So there's just warehouses full of this stuff. There's ships full of this stuff. Clearly, it's like an open secret that it's being traded, and Lin destroys it. Here's a picture, actually a photograph, right, of an opium den a little bit later, because this problem is going to go on for quite a while. And you can see these people are not going to be maybe productive members of society. They're certainly not going to be doing good things for the economy. It causes a lot of health problems long term. That's Commissioner Lin, right? He's the one that's going to be shaking things up. Okay, so here's the picture I was looking for. The way Lin does this, at first he thinks about, dumping it all into the river, but he thinks, I don't want to hurt the fish. They'll get too high or whatever. So he sort of burn berries it outside of the city and stuff like that. So he just takes this incredibly valuable amount of opium and destroys it. If you've ever seen any kind of crime drama, the one thing that drug dealers do not like is when you take their drugs, right? So this is going to upset a lot of British traders. In addition to this, Lin is just completely confused because these southern barbarians in some ways claim to have all of this new technology, all of this great culture. They have all of these philosophies and religion, and they talk about free trade, and they talk about all this stuff. But Lin sees them basically as immoral drug dealers. So he writes a letter to Queen Victoria, the monarch in charge of England, and explains the problem, because he thinks maybe she doesn't know what's happening. And he assumes that if she knew what her subjects were up to, or if the British government knew, they would fix the problem. So these British traders that are really pissed off go back to Britain, having lost an incredible amount of money. And they demand that the British government reimburse them for their losses, basically claiming that it's the British government's responsibility to protect free trade. The Chinese government, destroyed their product. Hence, the British government should make them whole. Meanwhile, back in Britain, people are still, or back in Guangzhou, British traders are still showing up with ships full of opium, right, coming from India, coming from Southeast Asia, and Lin's there waiting for them, and basically makes new contracts so that if you want to trade in Guangzhou, if you want to land your ship full of cargo, you have to sign a contract saying you won't sell opium. Well, the traders just refuse to sign. Where could this all be leading? It's a big problem. I have a great video about it. It's about 20 minutes long, which I know is kind of a long clip to be putting into one of these, but it's so good I'm just going to put it in there. So for about the next 20 minutes or so, I'll play this video. That's part of the Pacific Century series. We'll see more from them in the future. This was back when these sorts of documentaries that they made were just awesome. So it's a little bit old, but it has access to a lot of stuff that you just kind of can't get now. Anyway, I'll play a clip. It's about Commissioner Lin and the beginning of the Opium War, and then we'll talk more specifically about how that's going to unravel, how these British traders are going to end up leading to a war between the Chinese and the British. So let's watch this movie clip. It's about 20 minutes, then we'll get back to it.
Its tea was irresistible. For centuries, China had allowed foreign traders access to these goods as a matter of noblesse oblige. To its rulers, China was the master civilization, and all other nations tributary states. This was not the relationship Great Britain had in mind. In 1793, a British emissary named Lord Macartney was sent to Peking to ask the Emperor Qianlong to treat Great Britain as an equal trading partner.
Macartney said he was representing King George, and King George wanted to say hello and pay his respects and start trade. Well, said the Qianlong Emperor, if this George fellow wants to kowtow, that's all right. Go ahead. But, we don't really need you. You're rather quaint, and you wear some funny, rather stuffy clothes. These presents you've brought us are not really very much, considering what we're used to. But it's perfectly all right if you want to be vassals of China. Good, go ahead. But don't ask for any favors.
Our ways have no resemblance to your barbarous land. As your ambassador can see for himself, our celestial kingdom possesses all things in prolific abundance. We have never valued strange objects, nor do we have the slightest need for your country's manufacturers.
This is the port of Macau, a Portuguese dependency 30 miles from Hong Kong. 400 years ago, it was the first Chinese concession to Western seaborne traders. The Chinese walled off Macau from the rest of the country and let the Portuguese build their own community. By the 19th century, other Europeans and Americans lived here the way they lived back home, dancing quadrilles and hosting elegant tea parties.
It must have been a piece of Europe put down on the coast of China for the delectation in vacation time of the merchants and their women, if they had any with them, and some did.
The Westerners' relations with the Chinese were filled with irony. The Chinese saw them as uncultured barbarians. They saw the Chinese as godless heathens. This is Macau's Protestant graveyard. Here lie missionaries and traders who sailed thousands of miles, braving pirates and disease. Though they had different motives, they came to Macau on the same quest, to open up China to Christ and free trade. One Englishman buried here had a different mission. He was a painter named George Chinnery. Fleeing his wife and debts, he stayed in Macau because he saw the light. Not the tinsel of heaven, but the golden hues of what one trader called a miniature Naples, set like a jewel on the threshold of immense and unknown China. Every October, the traders left their families in Macau and traveled 50 miles up the Pearl River to Canton. For centuries, this river has brought China vessels with grain from Java, Arab traders with spices from Sumatra, and envoys bearing tribute from Siam. Today, Canton is still a bustling center of trade with a strong merchant ethic. Through links with Hong Kong, Canton's merchants have made this coastal region of communist China into the fastest growing economy in the world. In the 19th century, China's rulers in Peking used the traders of Canton to deal with the outside world.
The Canton system was a system of limited trade. When the British came in, the Manchus basically devised essentially a containment policy. That is to say that all foreigners will be contained basically to one port.
In the 19th century, this wall ringed the city of Canton. No foreigners were allowed inside. To deal with the barbarians outside the city, the government appointed a group of 12 local merchants. Skilled traders, they were called the Hong merchants.
They became crucial because the old-fashioned mandarins, even old-fashioned merchants in China, were at a loss as to how to cope with this new group of people. So they need intermediaries. Their agents were the Han merchants.
While mandarins in Peking paid little attention, some Hong merchants made lots of money. The most famous was Haokwa, the richest man in the world in the 1830s. Trading with foreigners in China was not easy. The government forbid foreigners to learn Chinese and Chinese to speak foreign languages. So the traders and Hong merchants were reduced to speaking in pidgin English, using terms like loot, booty, and pidgin itself, which means business. The The Western traders lived and did their business in a row of white buildings called factories. No women were allowed inside, and the men were only permitted here for 6 months of the year, which for one missionary was long enough.
If you could see the packed-up way in which we have to live here, crammed as close to each other as jars of sweetmeats in a box of bran. No yard, no outhouses, no trees, no back door even.
Edward and Warren Delano were two Americans who lived in the factories. The patriarch of a powerful New England family, Warren is seated here with his grandson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Frederick Delano Grant is Warren's great-great-grandson. He has long been fascinated with the diaries his ancestors kept of their time in the China trade.
Edward provides a rather amazing description of a violent riot which breaks out, and of his escape, disguised as a Chinese, before a very doubting crowd. A riot provoked by two British having brought in their wives. Edward hated it. Edward refers to it as that vile whole Canton. Warren, by contrast, the man of business, likes it. He can get his work done here without interruption.
In the early years, Americans and British worked hard, but the Chinese traders made most of the money.
China had many things the West wanted. Teas, silks, porcelains, fireworks. We didn't have all that many things that China wanted. For a season or two, we could bring ginseng to them. We wreaked ecological catastrophe in the northwest coast, trying to get furs to carry to quite hot Canton. In time, it was just cash that we had, and while this made us popular, it was really having a horrible effect on our domestic economy.
Finally, the British and the Americans found an answer to their trade deficit. Opium. In China, it was illegal to grow poppies, the source of opium's narcotic resin. But the British harvested vast fields of poppies in their colony in India. At the British government factory in Patna, the poppy resin came first to the weighing room, where it was inspected. Next, it was dumped into stone vats, where it was dried, stirred, and sometimes cut with sand or brown sugar. Then cake makers, working at a rate of 12 an hour, molded the opium into round cakes the size of cannonballs. With 150 cake makers working, Patna produced 11,000 cakes a day, enough to keep 200,000 Chinese addicts smoking opium for a month. To compete with the British, Americans established the Turkish opium trade. In clipper ships, they set sail from Massachusetts, bought opium in Turkey, and carried their cargo to China. They also acted as middlemen for the British in Canton.
When my ancestor, my great-great-grandfather, Warren Delano, arrived in 1833, he joined a firm, Russell Sturgis and Company. Many articles of trade, but certainly a significant portion of the trade that Russell Sturgis was in, was opium.
I do not pretend to justify the prosecution of the opium trade from a moral and philanthropic point of view, but as a merchant I insist that it is a fair, honorable, and legitimate trade.
I considered it right to follow the example of England, the East India Company, and the merchants to whom I had always been accustomed to look up, the Perkins, the Peabodys, the Russells, and the Lowes.
The Perkins, the Peabodys, the Russells, and the Lowes were the first families of 19th century Boston. The money they made in the China trade helped build America. funding the railroads that took America west, endowing universities like Princeton, and paying for much of the research of Alexander Graham Bell. The China trade also established American missionaries in China. Peter Parker founded a hospital in Canton. Other missionaries, like the German Karl Gutzlaff, took a different approach. Gutzlaff served as a guide and interpreter on the Scottish opium boats of the Jardine Matheson Company.
Oh, Gutzlaff, he must have been a very interesting character. He was a loner. He was ambitious. I don't doubt his Christian convictions, but he was interpreter for merchants, and he would help distribute Bibles off one side of the ship while opium went off the other side.
Gutzlaff's employers were James Matheson, a Scottish financier, and William Jardine, a ship surgeon. In an early company bulletin, the Opium Circular, Jardine gushed about the financial promise of the illegal trade.
If the trade is ever legalized, it will cease to become profitable from that time. The more difficulties that attend it, the better for you and for us.
Jardine Matheson and their fellow traders devised a very clever scheme to smuggle their opium. From Macau, the opium traders would sail up to a deserted island called Lintin, Solitary Nail. At Lintin, protected by gunboats, the opium was transferred into storage ships, where it waited like groceries on a shelf for customers from Canton to claim it. On decks, choking with balls of opium and silver, Chinese middlemen bought their drugs. They smuggled them back to shore in boats called fast crabs or scrambling dragons. For the foreign merchants, there was almost no risk involved.
Sales were pleasantness and remittances were peace. Transactions seemed to partake of the nature of the drug. They imparted a soothing frame of mind and no bad debts.
We are not smugglers, gentlemen. It is the Chinese government. It is the Chinese officers who smuggle and connive at and encourage smuggling, not we.
Whoever was responsible, there was no denying the effects, as Edward Delano discovered years later in an opium den he visited in Singapore.
One man was prostrate under its effects, pale, cadaverous, and death-like in appearance. He was quite insensible to touch, for when I took his pipe from his hands, he offered no resistance, though his eyes tried to follow me.
By 1835, over 2 million Chinese were addicted to opium.
The lower classes took to it because they found it stimulating and kept them at work longer than the undernourished people could have coped with the kind of workloads they had. So opium sort of eased their pain. The upper classes were greatly affected by it in a way very much like today. It's the middle class and above, the people who had the money, the young, bright children of such families were the ones who took to it, and they destroyed the basis of that already rather thin literati class that provide the ruling elites of China.
The emperor's court was extremely worried. But what did they do? Well, some people said, conventionally, of course, let's just punish all the opium smugglers. The others said, let's punish both the smugglers and the opium eaters. A third group said, why not legalize opium? In fact, the solutions they suggested were strikingly similar to the solutions proffered to solve the drug problem in the United States a century later.
In this film, produced in 1959, the Communist government of China told its version of the Opium War.
销鸦片毒害了千千万万的中国人民。到1838年，仅广州一地就输入了4万多箱鸦片，抢走了3000多万两银子，中国的经济濒于破产了。这是中国人民不能容忍的。
The hero of this film is an incorruptible official named Lin Zexu. The Manchu emperor appointed Lin High Commissioner, a virtual drug czar, with the power of the empire to stop the Canton opium trade. The communists in power today have a reason for keeping the spirit of Commissioner Lin alive. From party theorists to school teachers, Lin has become an enduring symbol of the need to stand up to the corrupting influences of foreign trade. In 1839, Commissioner Lin arrived in Canton to survey the forces he would use to stop the opium trade.
这炮是哪一年出的？乾隆42年，比我还大3岁了。能够试一炮吧？行，请吧，开炮。大帅，您看，咱们就是这样的炮。
The Manchu military power was basically built, like the Mongols, was built on horse. They simply did not expect that the new groups of barbarians would not come from the continental border, but from the sea.
Lin wanted to know more about the foreign devils who were pushing opium.
小王，那不是商馆吗？是的。把船靠近一点。
As he surveyed the Canton factories, Lin decided that the British merchants must be outlaws. The British government couldn't possibly support men like these.
So here you have a macho British trader who feels limited by a condescending Chinese system. For the Chinese Mandarin, they will say, well, who are these people? Just a bunch of real barbarians who drink and who eat and who do all these nasty things, and who, of course, smuggle opium.
Lin decided to write a letter to a more cultured foreigner, the Queen of England.
There is a class of evil foreigner that makes opium and brings it for sale, tempting fools to destroy themselves merely in order to reap profits. What is here forbidden to consume, your dependencies must be forbidden to manufacture. If you do, you will be acting in accordance with decent feeling, which may also influence the course of nature in your favor.
The British never delivered Lin's letter to the Queen. Impatient for results, Commissioner Lin blockaded all foreigners in their Canton factories. Then he forced the Canton traders to hand over their entire opium stock, over 3 million pounds. Not wanting to burn it lest people inhale the fumes, he ordered it dissolved in river trenches. These are the trenches where Lin dissolved the opium. Standing on these banks, Lin offered a prayer as the opium flowed to the sea.
You who wash away all stains and cleanse all impurities should tell the creatures of the water to move away for a time, to avoid being contaminated. The foreigners do not dare to show any disrespect, and indeed I should judge from their attitudes to have the decency to feel heartily ashamed
Far from ashamed, the outraged opium traders hurried to London to address the British Parliament. They demanded their government either pay for their losses or force the Chinese to do so, even if that meant war. A future prime minister responded with contempt.
They gave you notice to abandon your contraband trade. When they found you would not do so, they had the right to drive you from their coasts. Justice, in my opinion, is with them. And whilst they, the pagans, the semi-civilized barbarians, have it on their side, we, the enlightened and civilized Christians, are pursuing objects at variance both with justice and religion. A war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and have not heard of.
But Great Britain was a tiny island with a small seafaring population, the very antithesis of enormous self-sufficient China. The lifeblood of England's empire was overseas trade, and by 1839, opium was the world's most traded commodity, the linchpin of the world trading system.
The position was impossible. Trade, as the West understood it, and as the British leading the West understood it, had to be open on their terms. And the Chinese, as they understood it, trade was peripheral, should be controlled and minimized and kept under strict conditions. And there was no way you could compromise between the two.
Okay, so you can see just a ton of stuff going on there, right? Talking about the British opium trade, how it's made, Americans getting in on the trade, bringing it from Turkey, this idea. It's funny because they tell the story of Commissioner Lin as digging the trenches to flood the opium. Sometimes it's told as he like lights it on fire and quickly like buries it so it can't smoke out or anything. But anyway, so you can see the setup, right? You have all of these British traders. Opium's the biggest commodity in the world. It's where they're making all of their money for the British Empire and more for the elites in Europe, or I mean in America. Also, you get this sense about how it's affecting the Chinese. Lots of poor people take little bits of it to make them more comfortable where they're working, right? So they're not cold or as hungry or tired or whatever. But then the middle class and above are using it recreationally. And that's much more of a problem. There's really only about 10% of the population that falls into that category. And they're starting to have big problems that are affecting the sort of Confucian system and who they're going to draw on. And this is a famous sort of narrative at this time that, you know, oh, this Confucian scholar has two sons that were going to go up for the exam and they're going to be great, you know, future bureaucrats, but they get into opium or something, you know, and so it's sort of that. And we'll see that when we read The Daughter of Han. Her husband uses opium, and so we'll see this whole process going forward. Anyway, near the end there, you get a sense of the British reaction to this back in Britain. Some members of Parliament in Britain said, hey, you know, you're dealing drugs illegally, basically, and you got caught, and so whatever happens to you is okay. Other people found that really offensive and found it sort of a call to war, that the Chinese would dare to mess with Britain's greatness. So as it turns out, the British government is going to decide to send a fleet of ships to protect their interests and sort of defend legitimate British trade in China. The problem is the British are acting illegally. So on its very face, it has a number of issues. The way they defend British interests, by the way, is they attack Chinese ports when the Chinese try to turn away British merchant ships. And their pretense is, look, you don't know what's in these ships. We're legitimate traders, and we're, you know, demand to be able to trade. This concept of free trade was at its sort of all-time high. And so we're just going to go ahead and show you until you let our British ships land and conduct their totally legitimate trading. Now, of course, they were smuggling opium, but that doesn't particularly matter. This is where you get, by the way, the famous ship, the Nemesis, which the name is used all the time in sort of Star Trek and other things, right? A very famous British ship, some of the fastest ship in the world at the time, quite heavy armaments. So the Chinese had no way to deal with this. The Ming at one time had really advanced naval technology that had been largely shuttered, and they hadn't developed these sort of new cannons, new naval technologies for quite a while. The Qing, like it says in that video, right, were horse riding people from the north. That's how they got their empire together, unifying those Mongol tribes, Tibetans, Central Asians. The south was relatively strange to them, right? You can't ride a horse out into the ocean. You can't like bravely charge them. So they show that cannon that barely shoots into the beach. How are you going to hit those ships, right? So the Qing didn't really have any particular naval force. The British had the best in the world. So it was just a super mismatch. The British fleets start to come under fire on their own. Once you start shelling Chinese cities, of course they're going to respond. So the Chinese respond, and there is some damage to British merchant vessels and to these ships that are just defending the merchant vessels. So it's war, right? The British are now in a situation where they've sort of struck that match, and the fuse is burning. So you can't turn it off sometimes, right? These little political decisions or economic decisions lead to a situation where you hit a tipping point and there's really no way to pull backwards. So the British need to commit fully. They send their navy up the Yangtze River into the Grand Canal, and basically they start to blockade all of Chinese commerce. Remember, the Grand Canal connects the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So the British Navy is in the Yangtze, they're in the Grand Canal, they're in those harbors all around China's southern regions, so they really just have naval supremacy over the Chinese. At the same time, they're getting closer and closer to China's main cities, places like Nanjing and eventually up into northern China a little bit. They don't blockade Beijing per se, but the Grand Canal does go up into northern China to the Yellow River. So the tax money that's supposed to be going up north can't. The food's not moving around the way it's supposed to be. All that sort of stuff. It's absolutely obvious to the Qing government that they're not going to be able to combat this navy or solve this situation immediately through military force. So they are forced to negotiate a peace with the British, and the Qing government actually had some experience negotiating, right? As you read in that, or if you read that article about the Qing, they do negotiate, they do work with other groups, the Mongols and Tibetans, right, again. So they were somewhat skilled at this, but the British were bringing a new form of colonial legalism and stuff that the Chinese just really hadn't seen in this sense. The war has ended pretty quickly, but it's really the resulting treaties that are most offensive and kind of weird to the Chinese and sort of create the situation in the 19th and 20th century that we're going to see play out in China. So here you have the British forces invading Guangzhou. It wasn't only sea battles, right? So remember, in southern China, it's very hilly, lots of waterways. You can see the British forces here invading that area. Here again, you can get a sense of the mismatch. The Chinese had rifles, of course. They weren't just fighting with swords or anything like that, but their rifles were like 2 or 3 generations earlier compared to what the British had. So the Chinese were still like breech-loading rifles and all this sort of stuff. Just no comparison really to the British technology at the rifle level, at the ship level, at the cannon level, you know, any kind of level you want to look at. The Chinese, of course, had a lot more people, but that doesn't necessarily matter if you have such technological mismatch in terms of weapons. So here's those British ships right? You can see them kind of going all around southern China, going into the ports, going into the Grand Canal, going up outside of Beijing and the harbor. Beijing's not right on the water, right? So it's more like Tianjin and stuff like that. That's close to the edge, and we'll see that that area is going to be a popular place for Europeans to kind of intercede. It's the closest they can get to the capital on the water. And this is a very destructive and humbling moment for the Chinese. The Qing government has, one of the biggest militaries in the world, one of the biggest economies in the world. But all of a sudden, the British, again, it's a relatively small nation without many people, but clearly very superior firepower, is really able to mess with them. And it causes big waves through China. So the Qing forces had been pretty well beaten up on by the British, a resounding sort of military defeat, although not so stinging for the Qing yet because they hadn't kind of fully unwrapped everything that meant. What the real problem was the sort of settlement that was reached. And this was the first of what comes to be called the unequal treaty system. So the first treaty is going to be after the first Opium War in 1842. It's called the Treaty of Nanjing. That's where it was negotiated and signed. But this leads to a series of different treaties, not just in China, but around Southeast Asia with Japan, Korea, as we'll see. And it was sort of the culmination of newly developing European ideas about liberalism, legal systems, white supremacy, colonization, imperialism, all kind of bound together. So these treaties ended the war, but they weren't a sort of negotiated peace that spelled out, what was going to happen for both sides. Basically, it was raw punishment for the Chinese and beneficial policies for Europeans. What was included in the treaty? Well, things like the British traders would not just have Guangzhou anymore to trade at. 5 new trading ports were opened. So the British could go to 5 new cities on the coast of southern China and conduct trade in the same way they had been in Guangzhou. Hong Kong, which at the time was a very small island just off the coast from Guangzhou, was permanently leased to Britain. Now, it was leased for $0, so it's ceded or it's just colonized, however you want to frame that. And it was on a 99-year lease. But at the time, what that really meant was forever and just sort of renewable. That was kind of the idea. So that was in 1842. Then the Qing were forced to pay $6 million for all of the opium that had been destroyed, $3 million to the merchants for their pain and suffering, and $12 million for the British war costs. So in today's money, this would be an absolutely overwhelming amount of money. Additionally, the next year, so after the war was over, after this treaty was signed, they just tacked on something to it, that British citizens would have extraterritoriality and most favored nation status in China. So these are kind of funny terms if you haven't heard them before. Extraterritoriality means that British subjects within China did not have to obey Chinese laws, and they could not be punished by Chinese legal authorities. They were extra to the territory, right? They were outside of the territory. So British citizens in China only had to obey the laws that were written for them in those locations by them. To wit, there were hundreds of cases of British folks killing or stealing or engaging in all kinds of rape, all kinds of horrible behaviors. And when the Chinese police tried to intervene, essentially the British authorities said, no, you can't arrest these people, you can't prosecute these people. The Chinese system of justice is barbaric, so we're not going to let them, stand before Chinese courts. And usually they were just sent home, and there was no punishment of any kind, because then they get back home and they're like, oh, well, they did some stuff in Asia, who knows? So a huge blow to China. The most favored nation status means that in the future, if any other country, and specifically they were thinking of like the United States, France, the Dutch, whatever, signed a treaty with China, whatever benefits were in that treaty would also go to Britain. So if someone signed a new treaty to open up a new trading port, the British would also be able to use it, etc. So this is absolutely devastating. It essentially removes a giant chunk of control from the Qing Empire in a way that now would be totally alien to the nation state, giving up territory, paying a crushing amount of debt, not having other people within your country subject to your laws, not being able to control your economy or your borders. So this system is really humbling for China, really offensive to China, and comes to be the reason that the Chinese just hate Europeans and Americans. But at the same time, they have to recognize the power that industrialization has given these people, and they can't necessarily fight against that. So out of these treaties, you didn't necessarily get peace. Opium remains illegal in China, right? But the British keep selling it anyway. Now they have more ports. The British know that the Chinese won't do anything about it because previously what happened was they were illegally selling drugs into China. They got caught, their drugs were destroyed, and that led to a war, in which case the British government in the end defended the merchants and got them their money back with incredible interest. So there's a certain impunity. Also, even if you catch some of these British people smuggling or whatever, it doesn't matter because they have extraterritoriality. They can't be punished by the Chinese. So there's more and more British smuggling opium, not caring about the consequences. But there is this idea that they need to sort of crack the Chinese market. And this remains common right up until today. When you go to business school, there's definitely this idea like if you could sell everybody in China one item, all of a sudden you would be a billionaire, right? So this idea that it's like this huge body of people just waiting to buy your product. You just have to crack into that market, right? You have to be able to come up with something that Chinese people need that you can sell them. So here you have John Bull merchant. John Bull just means British, right? It's just the British thing. So the British merchant, there's the opium, there's the gun. That's his trade negotiation, right? He's forcing the Chinese to take this opium at the barrel of a gun. But it didn't work out. Chinese people resisted this, even though it looks pretty hopeless. And this leads to quite a problem. Basically, in 1856, there's this ship called the Arrow. It's unclear who it belongs to. Was it Chinese? Was it British? Whatever. But it's smuggling opium. So the Chinese detain the ship and they arrest these Chinese smugglers that were on the ship. But it may have been owned by some British folks, so they thought that the Chinese had no cause to do that, and it caused a problem. The smugglers tried to raise this British flag, right, to get around these things and say, oh, we can't be arrested because, you know, it's a British ship. And it kind of blows up again really quickly. And the British react with force. They'd already realized how to do this. They knew exactly what to do. This time, France is going to join up with them as well. So the French and the British initiate what essentially is a second Opium War and ravish southern China, essentially punishing people that were trying to stop the sale of drugs. And by 1860, it's turned into a full-out conflict, and French and British Marines essentially land off the coast a little ways from Beijing and march to the capital. As they head towards the capital, in particular, they come across the old summer palace that's outside of Beijing in the hills. It's a nice place because it's a little bit cooler in the summer when it's really hot. This is a nice little cooler area because it's kind of up in the hills. And the French and British forces completely ransack it. So here you go, there's those French forces. right, the expedition to China, it says there on the bottom. So this is the Lion Gate Bridge, and if you go to China today, you can see this. It's a really cool kind of tourist attraction. The summer palace is all surrounded by lakes. There I am in the winter. It's all nice and frozen there, but they just trashed this place. There was a palace in the middle of this estate that no longer exists, that was sort of built to emulate a European palace by the Qing. The French and the British burn it to the ground. They absolutely destroy it. But before they do, they loot all of the Chinese artifacts that were there. This is what's left of the Summer Palace today. It was a huge, grand series of buildings. All that's left is sort of the stone columns from the inside. Very famously, a lot of these pieces, jewelry, artwork, statuary, porcelain vessels and everything, bronzes, that get stolen from the palace end up going back to Britain and France. Some soldiers just stole stuff while they were there. Others end up in museums. But by and large, it just goes home with soldiers in their pockets. This is a problem. You don't really want your soldiers behaving this way for British officers. But at the time, the idea was the Chinese are so sort of, barbarous and backwards that it's not really a bad thing to do this. In that grand house in the front, there were all these pillars, 12, that were the sort of zodiac signs, the Chinese zodiac signs, and on top of each pillar was a giant bronze head of one of the Chinese zodiac animals. So before knocking down all those pillars and burning the palace, British and French soldiers stole all these bronze heads that were on top of them. And some have been found. You can see the ones that are bronze there are the ones that still exist and are known about. Some are in museums, some have been returned to China. The ones that are marble, those are reproductions based on drawings and photographs of what was there. Those haven't been found. That means that some European families or American families just have them, chilling in their attic or whatever. People don't know about it, or maybe they were lost. So really destructive and absolutely affronting to the Chinese and the Chinese government. Remember what these British soldiers were doing. What these soldiers were doing was they were attacking China because they weren't being allowed to illegally smuggle drugs into the country. So from the perspective of the Chinese, this is just insane. From the perspective of the French and British, they're securing free trade and free enterprise for their people. So just a very big sort of clash. When this happens, the Emperor of China temporarily flees up to Manchuria because these British and French forces are invading. They don't really know the strength of these forces. They're not sure what's going to happen. So the Emperor, and this is not uncommon. It's not like he ran away necessarily. They just withdraw from the capital. And when he's up in Manchuria, he dies. When this Qing emperor dies, he has a boy son who's 5 years old, who becomes the new emperor Tongji. There he is. Doesn't he look cute? He can't even fill out his robes or anything yet in this photo, or this painting of him. So now you have a China that's been, for now 20 years, just thrashed militarily. It's shown that its naval forces are just a sneeze compared to what's going on in the West. On land, they've been beaten up by the British and French. They have this system of unequal treaties. One of their sort of capitals, outside the capital, has been completely ravished by foreigners, and the emperor has died, and there's a new 5-year-old on the throne. So the sort of weakness of the Qing by comparison to these newly industrialized European powers is really showing, and China is much diminished. At the same time, the arrogance of Europeans is really going through the roof, thinking, we can just do whatever we want to these Chinese whenever we want to, and that's not going to go away for kind of a long time. So out of those unequal treaties, you got a couple new treaty ports, but out of the second Opium War and the sort of series of treaties that follow, you just get a ton. So you can see labeled down there Hong Kong, and right above it is the city Guangzhou, or Canton, right from that video. So Canton used to be the only one, but you see those little triangle shapes, right? Those are treaties that were opened from the first Opium War. Then you see all those blue dots. Those are treaty ports that were opened after the second Opium War. So after the second Opium War, you can see there's a ton of cities, and it only increases. By 1900, there's 92 cities that Europeans essentially can reside in and conduct business in however they like, but they're not subjected to Chinese legal authority. That's a recipe for disaster. Imagine that there were 92 cities in the US where, I don't know, anybody you like, Brazilians could live and do whatever they wanted without any legal authority from the US or Chinese or whatever you like. It's just, it's for the nation, it's a real problem. During this time, so like the reason Hong Kong and Macau are sort of separate is those weren't trading port cities, those were just straight up colonies. Hong Kong by the British and the Macau by the Portuguese, right? So during this time, Shanghai becomes the largest and most modern city in China. By the end of the 19th century, Shanghai is the preferred port for a lot of these traders. It's closer to Korea and Japan. It's sort of easier trading route, but it's also at the mouth of the Yangtze River, so it's easy to have products from China coming out to the coast. However, despite Shanghai becoming this giant modern city, it's really only the European section of the city, the sort of treaty port section, that's becoming modern and wealthy, and that's on the backs of the local Chinese. So here's one of these treaty ports. Shanghai starts out as it's a small sort of, I mean, it's not totally unimportant, but it's a fairly small fishing community, trading community. When it becomes a European port, that's when it's really going to explode. And the Europeans start to build things like this there. Basically, they're trying to create what some world historians have termed like neo-Europes, like the United States and Australia, South Africa to an extent, right? These are neo-Europes. Basically, Europeans went there, they built European houses, they reproduced white people, they got rid of other people, they brought in European plants, animals, stuff like that, and they create like a Europe in miniature. This is exactly what was happening. European buildings, European plants, European people, just like in this new little bubble, right, that sort of was continuing to expand. And when you looked at this photo, you might think, okay, this could be anywhere. This could be in Australia, this could be in the United States, this could be in Canada, this, you know, who knows? But it turns out this is Shanghai, right? So this is this foreign delegation is really building. It's modern, hyper modern, right, by comparison to most of China, but it's at the expense of the Chinese. Here's a photo. So you start to get some really interesting stuff during this time. All of these photos, and so these foreign delegations, right, they're filled with modern, wealthy Europeans. So they have things like cameras, and they like to take pictures of stuff that they find interesting, like Chinese ladies, you know, dressed up for the photo and stuff like that. So you start to get some pictures, right? So I'm actually mixing in real photographs now because Europeans have showed up, they have cameras, and they take photos of this stuff. It's crazy. Here you go, here's trying to capture the life of like elite Chinese women, right, in Shanghai there. So this, you know, you can see stuff like this in paintings, but when you actually see a photograph, it really captures so much more, right? These are really amazing. So all of these prints are from a series of work that was found by a photographer who just happened to relocate to Shanghai. So mostly he's taking pictures of elites, but every once in a while he takes pictures of people like this. This is a broom salesman, right, that would have been just walking down the street selling brooms. So really complex, kind of cool stuff, give you a little taste of what was going on. But also you have to remember, it's totally exploitative. This guy was a merchant, one of the wealthiest, right, in the world. It's not like the Chinese didn't benefit from the system in some ways, right? They did. But like this guy did, but only, again, because many Chinese were put into abject poverty and slavery, and essentially slavery, and forced into these sort of opium addictions, right? That's where the British and Americans, to a lesser extent, were making all of their money off this trade. So they get to live like this, right? So here's a nice tennis club, a nice European tennis club that's formed in Shanghai. I wouldn't know about trying to wear all these clothes there. Shanghai can be hot sometimes. But so, again, that sort of speaks to this recreation of this wealthy European class in Shanghai, right? There you go, there's a street scene, so you can kind of get a sense of that it is still Chinese. Here you go. A nice little croquet game, you know, in Shanghai. This is a building that's still there. So if you go to Shanghai, this is famous still because there are some blocks that have all this European architecture and stuff. It's really odd. It really stands out. But it is a sort of injection of this new European industrialization and culture. It's there, and Chinese are getting exposed to it. It's not like they don't see it. It's not like it totally passes them by. Okay, so did the Chinese just take all this land down? What happened? Were they really just completely beat and out? No, not really. This caused a bunch of problems for the Qing government because they had to respond to Western aggression, but there were also Chinese people within the society that said, you're not doing enough, we're going to respond to you. So there's internal and external threats, right? Whenever there's problems like this, and the sort of new unequal contact between Europeans and Chinese led to strange outcomes. So one of the first we might look at is the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is one of the biggest, most destructive, wars in history, but most people don't know about it outside of China, which is strange. So South China was devastated by the Opium Wars. British troops and then French and British troops really beat up on the Chinese military. There was a lot of sort of destruction of the economy, but also it really showed the weakness of Qing authority in those areas in a sense. You can't have foreigners coming in, beating up your military on your own land and just like kind of leaving and stuff. It's a horrible look. Also at the same time, you have to remember that southern China is extremely diverse. The Qing were Manchus and kept some form of their ethnic identity, even though most people bought into them being authentically Chinese. In the South, there's tons of different ethnic groups, what we would now maybe call racial groups. It's really complex. So out of that sort of chaos that's happening, sometimes you get little trigger events that unleash even more problems. So one of these revolves around one man, Hong Xiuwan. He was a scholar, or he was being raised to be a scholar. Here he is. He had failed the Confucian exam, I think 3 times. And one time after failing an exam, he has a vision, a very strange vision. After failing his exam, he goes home, and on his way home, there's a missionary. So after the first Opium War, the British and French, but mostly the British, were allowed to continue missionary activities, at least in some areas. So a missionary hands him a pamphlet in Chinese about Christ. But, translation is bad. There's all kinds of problems. He kind of reads it. He's upset, whatever. So he has a vision in which Christ appears to him and says that actually there will be another coming, and it's him, and that he is the younger brother of Jesus. And that he should sort of assemble the righteous sort of Chinese to get rid of the Qing dynasty that's holding them back, or at least sort of declare or establish a new sort of heavenly kingdom. So based on a very thin reading of Christianity that was available at the time, Shi Huan declares himself a new sort of Christ emperor of a heavenly kingdom on earth. Taiping means heavenly kingdom. And he starts to round up and encourage people in the country around him, people that are anti-foreign, people that are anti-Qing, people that have heard about Christianity, people that are upset about the Confucian bureaucracy, all kinds of people, to join his cause, to rebel against the Qing. This leads to a massive civil war. Here's a sort of video game take on it. Fight for the rights of women, help reorganize society, stop overuse of drugs. I want you to join the Taiping Rebellion. Yeah, if you're Manchu, we'll come for you, right? Yeah, so anyway, it's really weird because on the outside it looks like a crazy guy who starts a war, essentially. But the Taiping rebels have a bunch of interesting ideas. They want just straight across the board equality for women. That's really interesting and kind of ahead of its time. They want society to be reorganized away from Confucian and Manchu ideas. That's really interesting. They're opposed to opium and the opium trade, which makes a lot of sense because the South is where most of the drugs are coming in and where they've seen the most sort of damage due to drugs. So it is a legitimate sort of movement that's picking up weird ideological stuff from missionaries, but also building on deep resentment of Southern Chinese against the sort of broader Qing government. Here is Xi Huan depicted as the heavenly emperor, you know. So you can see on this map where this takes place. So that province of, you know, where Guangzhou was, kind of up above Guangxi, and sort of several of the southern Chinese provinces now. The Heavenly Kingdom does form a government. It forms a military. It controls a certain amount of territory, and it wages a war against the Qing. It's incredibly destructive. People have reevaluated this and tried to figure it out. Because there are not the best demographic information sets or something like this from the time, we sort of have to guess, but based on what we can find, as many as 20 million people died in this civil war. That's incredible. By comparison, in the US Civil War, I mean, it's way, way, way less. I think like 600,000 or something. So it's just an unbelievable number. And that's just one sort of episode. There are a lot of rebellions like this that take place during this time because it's clear that Chinese society is starting to fall apart. Something's happened. This pressure from the outside is too much. At the same time, there's other movements to try and reinvigorate the Qing or reinvigorate Chinese society to resist these Westerners. One such movement is the Tongxi Restoration, so 1862-74. So remember, he's the new emperor that was only 5. Well, he's gotten a little bit older. Here's still the Taiping forces. So there's the Tongxi emperor. He's a little bit older. And actually, he has some pretty darn good policies. The ideas that he comes up with are to essentially study what was happening in the South, study the British and French forces, try to understand what was going on, engage in military and social reforms, think about commercial growth in areas other than opium, to try to strengthen the economy, which will lead to strengthening individual families, which will lead to strengthening the state, and sort of make China great again, as it were. And they're fairly successful. Again, often textbooks play this as like a cynical thing, and it just totally didn't work, and whatever. And we'll see that, yeah, 20 years later, it hasn't really worked, but it was a real legitimate attempt by a lot of Chinese at the time, and it was a sort of peaceful era, but the idea was something new has happened. The world's drastically changed. What are we going to do about it, right? And you don't always hit on a winner, and they didn't necessarily, but they hit on a lot of winning techniques that are going to carry through into the later Qing. So here you go. Here's some of these. So imagine you're a Confucian official. Your whole world has revolved around studying the Confucian classics and applying those to your job and working for the Chinese state, for the bureaucracy. And all of a sudden, the idea is, let's look at the West and let's copy what they're doing. What are these Europeans doing that are so smart that's beating us? So now all these Confucian scholars that their whole sort of philosophical drive has been to look to the past of China as the best thing ever, are now kind of looking to contemporary Europe and trying to figure out what they're doing that's working. So this sort of innovation, this sort of technological use hasn't really been embraced by these people before. But these are the sort of height of society that have to now be engaging in these practices, right? So it's really tricky. Yes, black ships. We're going to hear more about these black ships in a second. During the Tongji Restoration, the Chinese actually do make their own black ships. They make their own steam-powered ships, which is really incredible. So it's not like the Chinese can't modernize or they can't become technologically advanced. They do. But we're going to see the pace doesn't work and the sort of totality of it doesn't work. Here you go. Here's those Confucian scholars that are embracing new learning, or trying to anyway, right? Okay, so let's leave off China for a second. We'll turn to Japan and try to think about what they were doing, how they were interacting with a lot of these same forces. We looked at last time the Tokugawa, and thinking about some of the changes that were happening to society in the early modern period and to the samurai. You're going to see a lot of this as you start doing the reading coming up, but you're going to see a lot of similarities but some differences, right? There was a long sort of series of changes that were already happening in Japan, and right at that period is when they're going to be forced to deal with the same pressure from Europe and the United States. So remember, we saw the Tokugawa had been going through a lot of changes. By the mid-1800s, the samurai hadn't been at war for 250 years. And we talked about what that did to them a little bit. Most samurai families were bored, they were poor, a lot of them were in debt. They were being paid in rice by the daimyo lords, but they're not supposed to get jobs because they're samurai, they're a non-working class. But they really do kind of work for the lords. They do things like manage their books, and they are kind of a police force, but the society was very stratified and very stable, so they didn't really do a lot of that. Even the elites had a lot of problems. Money was kind of running out. That system of alternating attendance worked really well. Society at large had a very high quality and high standard of living, but the samurai class themselves was really kind of falling to pieces. At the same time, the Tokugawa Shogunate was losing power in that there was no real grip of the central government. There was no particular one direction of the central government. They were having a lot of trouble with this sort of maintaining a reason to exist, in a sense. This is right when the Europeans have been kicked out and the Dutch are continuing to trade with the Tokugawa government, through Nagasaki. And when there's sort of these early contacts, right? So here you see a bunch of samurai, but if you look at these guys, most of them are old, they're kind of fat, they're keeping records for their lords. They're not like, you know, super athletic sword wielding, like that's just not, you're going to see, there's actually some pictures of this, right? So, but particularly in the sort of southern regions of Japan, there is some contact between these samurai families and Dutch society. Now, one of the things the samurai class is most interested in is Dutch sort of medicine and technology, and also Dutch weaponry. And that's going to be kind of important when you read Fukuzawa, you're going to see that firsthand. So there you go, there's a samurai in his armor having a picture taken. This could have been his father's armor, grandfather's armor. However, he would have never used it in battle. Not even close, right? Because there wasn't one. So these samurai hadn't ever actually fought. It just wasn't a thing. Here's another picture of a samurai from southern Japan. Pretty cool, right? We're into the age of photographs, so you can actually see them. So yeah, I still wouldn't want to like engage in some kind of sword combat with him, obviously. But also a sort of changing reality for these folks. Right? Here we are as we get closer to the sort of period I'm talking about. A lot of these samurai, their swords are rusty, right? They're not using them. They wear the sword still. It's a status marker. Really, during the day, what they do is they're an accountant or something. So it's a really different sort of life than you might imagine for the samurai. Here's another picture of one, right? So here's those Dutch. Remember, there is some contact. The idea that Japan was totally closed it's just not true. The Dutch were allowed to stay in large part because they didn't engage in a lot of missionary activity. They were mostly just interested in commerce and cultural exchange to a certain extent. There you go, Dutch flags everywhere. So the Japanese themselves saw these Dutch and tried to understand what it was. They weren't living in a bubble. They knew about the Opium Wars. They knew what was going on to an extent with China and the British and French dealings there. So they were trying to understand these strange barbarians as well and get a sense of what they were doing. That's the Dutch colony, right? Or not colony, but like island off Nagasaki where they could trade. There you go. There you'll see some contact, right? The Nagasaki Museum has this. It's a painting of these Dutch guys, but you'll notice there's Japanese folks there too. So unlike in the Chinese case where the foreigners are really totally kind of segregated out, the Japanese did interact with the Dutch on this island in Nagasaki, and that's going to have some interesting consequences, right? Again, when we get to Fukuzawa, you'll see some of that and what that means. There you go. It's a nice painting. This one's much more in the Dutch style, right, of Japan. Yes, here's some of these early books. So Dutch learning describes this period in Japan where they're actively trying to learn Dutch a little bit, some of the elites, and they translate Dutch books or Dutch medical texts or Dutch ideas into Japanese. So you get some books like this that are very strange. They're like Japanese covers of a Dutch book. Again, it's really hard to explain, but Fukuzawa talks about it a lot. So you'll see this. Just kind of keep it in the back of your mind. There you go. This is describing a microscope, right? So the Dutch have this new technology that the Japanese are getting interested in. And this is a smelting process for, or not smelting, it's for isolating. Hold on, let me see if I can read this. Okay, so this is for isolating ammonia, I think. Anyway, so there's like a chemical distillation, right? Or chlorine. anyway, it's a process for pulling ammonia, I think, out of urine, actually, which the Dutch were quite famous for. So ammonia is a cleaning product, but it's also an industrial product of all kinds of different purposes. And you can extract it from urine, which is how it was done early on. Now it's all synthetic, but I think that's what this is describing. Okay, so very good. The Japanese are learning some stuff about the Dutch, and they're aware of what's going on out there. But something crazy is going to happen that really tips the scales in Japan and sort of causes a new series of events. Basically, during the 19th century, the United States is beginning to has made it all the way to the West Coast, right? That was new. For most of the U.S. history, right, up until this point, they weren't on California, Oregon, Washington, right? A lot of that was British or Russian or Spanish. But so now the United States has made it all the way to the West Coast, and they're starting to engage in whaling in the Pacific. And so there's lots of American ships that are out whaling. You kill the whales so that you can use them to produce basically a petroleum-like product that runs lamps, right? You harvest essentially their fat. So there were a lot of American whalers that were out in these new steam-powered ships. But these ships need coal, they need water, they need food. They got to be out there following whales for a long time. And the Japanese refused to let Americans land their ships in Japan to take on coal or fresh water and all that sort of stuff. The Japanese government just didn't want them there. This ties into expelling the foreigners early on, but also they're becoming a little bit phobic of what these Europeans are doing around Japan and around China, right? So in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry is sent by the United States government to negotiate with the Japanese. He had a legacy already. He had been in the Mediterranean. The Americans had done these sorts of negotiations in places like Hawaii. And basically his idea was he got a really big iron steam-powered ship. There he is, Commodore Matthew Perry. And he was going to take his steamship up to Tokyo, point the guns at the city, and demand that the Japanese open up all of their ports to American trade. From the Japanese perspective, this is what it looked like. They refer to these as black ships, not because they were necessarily painted black or anything like that, but because this black smoke billowed out of the top of them, right? These are steam-powered ships. So anyway, these ships seem super foreign to the Japanese. Most Japanese would have never seen a European before. Very, very strange to them. These ships were frightening. The depiction of the foreigners the Japanese made at the time are absolutely frightening. I mean, you can tell by the ship, it's crazy looking, right? And the fact that Perry's idea of negotiation was simply to point cannons at the city didn't help matters. So here's some depictions of Perry by the Japanese, you know, not looking too weird. Here's an American depiction, right, of what happened next. Basically, the government agrees, and the leadership in Tokyo, or Edo, right at the time, same place basically, the leadership in Edo is scared of the Americans. They're scared of these gunboats. They know what's happened in the Opium Wars to an extent. So they cave really quickly, and at Kanagawa, the U.S. and Tokugawa delegation meet, and they decide that 2 ports will be opened for trade between the Japanese and the United States, and things like shipwreck Americans will be taken care of. They won't just be turned away. A U.S. consulate will be allowed to open in Japan, and, as we've seen before from these unequal treaties, that the United States will get most favored nation status. So again, that means if the Japanese sign any treaty with Russia, China, Britain, whoever, that all of the same benefits, whatever's in that treaty, the Americans can pick to have it as well. It's a pretty, gross aspect of these sorts of treaties. So this really throws off the Japanese. It just happens to coincide with this time when the Tokugawa are not doing very well, and they're really in no position to resist the Americans. Here's a depiction of Perry by the Japanese as well. So you can see that Westerners seemed very strange to the Japanese. They have exaggerated facial features, right? There's a lot of these sorts of images. Here's another one by a Japanese person depicting an American person, right? So big noses, weird beards, crazy facial shape, right? All that sort of stuff. I like this one. This one, I feel like I got the most connection to this guy. Crazy eyebrows, giant nose, weird facial hair. So a lot of the Japanese, they had no context for meeting these people. These people are really threatening, and not just because of their race or appearance or something like that, but because they literally are pointing guns at them. So rightfully so. But Perry made some interesting choices. And one of the things he did to show his friendship after pointing guns and forcing them to sign a treaty was he left some presents that he had brought for the Japanese. And one of the presents that he brought was a fully working steam train. It was just a miniature steam train. So here it is depicted. So it was a real working steam engine that you fed coal into, and it powered there's a couple hundred feet of track or whatever, and you could do it kind of like a toy train. And this is going to have really big implications, because the very first thing that happens when Perry and the soon-to-be Marines or whatever leave is the Japanese dissect this train and they rebuild a real-size model. So the assumption that this would be like a novelty that would just blow the Japanese away might well have been true. But they immediately were like, aha, let's reverse engineer this thing and make our own one. So it turns out maybe it wasn't the best thing Perry could have given them for securing advantage. But we'll get back to that a little bit later. So Perry's arrival caused a really big shakeup. So as I had talked about a little bit, right, there were these daimyo families, these big families. Lots of them were losing wealth. And in the 19th century, there were still 200 of them. So here you can see daimyo territory in Japan in 1664, and then all of the shogun's lands are in yellow. So you can see that Tokugawa has like kind of holdings all across, right? But the shogunate was kind of weak, and a lot of these daimyo were growing in power on their own. So the shogun, when Perry arrived, didn't want to make a lot of choices on his own in terms of how to respond to this new threat from Westerners. So what he did was he sent out basically a census, or like a poll, to all of the daimyos, and 61 responded. And he asked, what should we do? So of the 61 that responded, 19 accepted the American demands, 19 were against it, so pretty even split. 14 said, oh, this is going to lead to war. 7 said, okay, let's temporarily give them this. And 2 said they'll just do whatever the shogun wanted. So pretty diverse opinions. The daimyo weren't much help. So the central authority had kind of flagged, and the daimyo were kind of all over the place. So what do? Well, it's a real problem. Here's the census report, by the way, an actual image of it, which is kind of crazy that we have this. But 2 clans in particular, two big households, were really against concessions to the Americans. And these are both from southern Japan. the Satsuma and the Choshu. So those are kind of important names to remember because we're definitely going to see them again. Here they are, right? Here's Satsuma, right? So very, very far southern Japan. I think I have Choshu in here too. And there's Choshu. So again, very southern Japan. And these groups had some more connection to Dutch learning than the rest, and that's like a part of why they have that. But they also had maintained a slightly more rigorous sort of version of samurai warrior culture, even though they didn't necessarily have combat to engage in and stuff like that. They were closer to Korea, maybe that's a part of it. In any event, these two daimyo provinces or domains were very much against dealing with Westerners. It's going to be important for the future. So how did they respond? Okay, the Americans have shown up. Now they're here. We've made these concessions to them. The shogun, even though the daimyo were really split, went ahead with it anyway. Well, there had kind of already been developing this thing called national learning. So in part this was tied to Dutch learning, in part this was tied to changes in the Qing dynasty, but there was this ongoing sort of early modern transformation that was already happening in Japan when Perry showed up. And as part of this school of national learning, there was a renewed interest in Japanese mythology and literature, things like the Kojiki, right, that we looked at, Japanese history, imperial lineages, a quest to sort of understand what it was to be truly Japanese. And this goes along with a new patriotic slogan that develops called "Revere the Emperor, Expel the Barbarians." So the School of National Learning, particularly after Perry shows up, gets this sort of what we might call like a nationalistic impulse that Japan is great and anybody from the outside is really a sort of disruptor, right, and should be removed. And one of the sort of shining stars of this movement is Yoshida Shoin. So Shoin is a samurai. He's from Choshu, right? So one of those southern provinces that's really against concessions to Perry. And he is a really interesting character. So Perry's ship pulls up on the way, and he tries to sneak onto the ship. And his idea is to sort of find out what is going on with these Americans. For his efforts, Shoin was arrested. While in prison, he started a sort of school of anti-Western thought, or at least a school that proclaimed the greatness and sort of nativism of Japan in comparison to what he thought of the Westerners. And he sort of helped create, or was part of this new vibe, that the emperor was the real center, the real heart of Japan, and had always been, which of course wasn't true, we know, but it was a sort of idea he had. When he gets out of jail, him and some of his friends set up an assassination plot where they try to kill basically a messenger of a relative of the shogun. Anyway, it's complicated. He gets caught, though, and executed. Many of his students go on to be important people in what's coming next, in the sort of samurai rebellions and the Meiji Restoration. So he had a really big effect on Japan. He created, or at least really took part in, this movement that was creating a new strand of nationalist thought, intellectuals thinking about Japan in a specific way, a more xenophobic way, a more anti-Western kind of thing. Not anti-Western in terms of they didn't want the technology or the trade or anything like that, but more they were opposed to what they saw as a sort of colonial or imperial endeavor by these places, these unequal treaties, right? And they knew that it would sort of only get worse unless they resisted. So there you go, another picture of him. It's a good one. Yeah, so here you have this sort of violence against Westerners. Here's a sumo depicted beating up a, some poor hapless European that's challenged him or something. So this sort of highlights the way a lot of Japanese felt that really Japan was stronger, right? This is sort of a metaphor for that. But it wasn't just a metaphor. In 1860, 1861 in particular, there was lots of violence against Westerners, these new Americans and then British that were showing up based upon the opening of Japan by Perry. Many were murdered, including one British translator in particular, but there was lots of anti-Western sort of violence. This guy was a British translator that a samurai snuck in and killed him in the middle of the night. This photograph goes back to Britain and really causes a stir in terms of people thinking of Japan as like a violent warrior society, when really that wasn't necessarily the case, and sort of set some things into motion that the government probably didn't want to begin with. This includes the end of the Tokugawa Shogunate. So by 1863, the sort of anti-Western violence was flourishing. There was a lot of resentment against the Tokugawa because they had given in to Perry's demands, and many daimyo saw it as like too easy, too capitulating, too sort of, they'd given away too much too quickly. So this sort of extremists, you might call them terrorists, you might call them loyalists, I don't know, it depends what side you're on, gain control of the imperial court and give a proclamation that by such and such a date, all foreigners must be out of Japan. People weren't really sure what to make of this. This was a small group of seemingly kind of crazy samurai that had taken over, and it wasn't really clear if they had taken over or how serious they were, or if this was just an angry reaction to Matthew Perry and stuff like this. But they were serious about it. So Choshu, right, one of those southern provinces, after this date, some Western ships were passing by, and the Choshu took some of their nice new cannons they had been working on, and they fired on those ships. So this one province, kind of on its own in southern Japan, fires on European forces. This is going to lead to not quite an openly declared war, but in 1864, a series of Western nations gets together. It's a joint Western fleet, which we're going to see a few more times, particularly in China, where all of a sudden the British, French, Dutch, Americans, they kind of can all get together for a minute to beat up on China or Japan. So this fleet goes and they bomb these Choshu short forts. Now remember, at this time that means they're shooting from ships, there's no airplanes or anything. But basically they bombard it with cannon fire and just destroy these Choshu outposts that were supposed to be so strong. This is a really big problem because Choshu was supposed to be one of the more militarized samurai states in the south. But these Western ships just pull up with these cannons and mess them up, and then they go on shore and they take the Choshu's cannons and stuff. And so it's very clear that the Japanese military cannot resist the sort of industrialized naval forces of the West. A new slogan starts to arise during this time amongst the people: rich country, strong army. Now, we've seen this before a long time ago, way back in the Han during legalism. So this is based on very old sort of Chinese ideas about nationality, but it's kind of given a new format. So this idea is becoming more and more popular that Japan has to be wealthier, it has to be stronger, that the reason these Western folks can beat them is because they have more money, so they have better weapons, and that if you have a rich enough nation, you'll be able to have a strong military, and that's all you need, really. So in line with that, the shogun is very, very upset. He feels like Choshu firing on these Westerners has damaged Japan. It's hurting trade opportunities. So the shogun attacks the Choshu province to like put them in their place and put down this sort of rebellion, this anti-Western rebellion that's fermenting there. So here you have, you know, the samurai attacking other samurai to sort of stop them from trying to interfere in this new sort of international politic that the shogun is trying to create. But in 1867, there's a new shogun, and the tide has totally changed. The sentiment in Japan is changing, and there's this idea that the shogun has kind of lost power, and maybe wasn't even the seat of power anyway, right? History's being rewritten, that it's really the emperor. So the new shogun puts the emperor into power and says, really, it's the emperor that's in charge of Japan. This is a nice little trick, because as we know, the emperor hasn't been in charge of Japan for more than 1,000 years, ish, you know, and there was always kind of conflicting power struggles and stuff like this. So this idea that the emperor is the true power, it's kind of interesting. It doesn't really fit, but it goes along with the new ideology of national learning, and some of the Choshu and Satsuma samurai are interested in these ideas. So, but it's not quite enough. So in 1868, the samurai from Satsuma attack the new shogun, they attack the imperial palace, and they claim a sort of new imperial era. So that's it, that's the end of the Tokugawa. Here's those Satsuma samurai plotting. So they're making a plan to really sort of rewrite the social structure of Japan. It's not necessarily going to be about the emperor, it's not about the Tokugawa, it's going to be something else. Now this is all in a response to the Tokugawa's choices in regards to Matthew Perry, but also a lot of things that were going on internally at the time anyway. So basically this is the start of the Meiji Restoration, but not quite. As we're going to see next time, these samurai, this is kind of the last, well, this is literally what they make that silly movie, The Last Samurai, about, but this is kind of the last thrust of the samurai class to try and maintain the samurai as the top of the social order in Japan. And long story short, it doesn't work. So we'll get to that kind of next time. Okay, so who's this guy, Fukuzawa Yukichi, that you guys are going to be reading about? If you haven't seen him, or if you haven't started reading the book, get into it. You should be able to answer some of these questions pretty quickly. You can get reading on him, and then you can kind of finish that up over spring break. So by now we definitely have pictures. Here it is. Here's a picture. Depending on the book you got, the picture on the cover will be him as an old man. So some key things to sort of think about as you do the reading, because you might want to try to put this reading into context, right? Try to think about where he was from and how did that influence his early life. So remember, I've been talking about Satsuma and Choshu and these sort of different divisions within the daimyo. Make sure you have a sense of where Fukuzawa fits into that. He'll talk about it. Then think about his early education. What was his father like? How did he raise him? What was it like to be a samurai at this time? How was he educated? All that will really go a long way into sort of helping you think about what he does in the future, right? So we're going to see him live through a really interesting time, and a lot of that is sort of based on some of his early education. Then we've been talking about Dutch learning. How does he come to be a part of that? You might find that really funky if you've ever tried to learn a foreign language. If you ever did study abroad or something like that, maybe you'll pick up on some of these issues. But he's going to come to study Dutch learning, And then what happens? So we've been talking about Matthew Perry coming and these sort of joint fleets. What's going to end up happening to the Dutch learning? So pay attention to that in his material. There's a whole, well, I mean, there's a whole big sort of changeover that happens to him where he switches and he starts to study English. So try and figure out what's going on there and how that's happening, why he has to start studying English, and see if you can get a handle on what his life was like in Osaka. So we can discuss more of these. These are things that will come up in the discussions. I just want you to kind of have a little bit of this before you get too deep in the reading, so you can have these things in the background as you're reading through the material, kind of help set it in a specific tone. There's Fukuzawa a little bit later. This picture has a really interesting story, so make sure you don't skip that in the book. He'll talk about this picture. There he is, as a dreamy young samurai, thinking about what he's going to do with his life, you know. Now he's getting a little bit older, right? So you'll notice a pretty big change. He doesn't necessarily look like a samurai anymore. What happened? The book's going to talk about this an awful lot. So you'll notice there's something really drastic, right? And there he is on the 10,000 yen note. So Fukuzawa is still very important to the Japanese. He's seen as a sort of Benjamin Franklin character, or I mean, he's a national treasure in terms of his role that he played in the sort of end of the Tokugawa, the Meiji Restoration, and sort of some stuff after that. So pay attention to all those things. There he is as an old man. So next time, it's spring break. You have plenty of time to read that Fukuzawa. I'll get those midterms graded and get all that stuff back to you. So let me know if you have any questions. Look out for all that material this time and just get cracking on that Fukuzawa reading, see what you make of it, and enjoy your spring break, you know? All right, see you next time.